Greetings, denizens of the Empire. It's Jabari here. If you've been following my content for any length of time, you probably know that one of the primary reasons for From Nothing's existence is simple, and that is that many aspects of sub-Saharan African history as a whole are shrouded in mystery or simply ignored due to lack of emphasis in the region in popular media and education systems. Also, I'm sure you've already learned many fascinating facts regarding African history, which I discuss in great detail in my content. In this episode, I would like to discuss 10 different aspects of West African culture and history which I find quite interesting, compelling, or just misunderstood, most of which are shrouded in mystery or have little to no dedicated effort put into proper education or investigation of the topics themselves. However, these topics are very important when trying to understand the nuances regarding West African culture and history collectively, and if you're new to this channel, this video can serve as a good starting point. Bear in mind they are in no particular order or structure and don't focus on any specific category. Note, the contents of this video were created by Jalil Bela, the author of the book, Grio's Tell No Lies. I will simply be narrating the script that was created by him. This video was not sponsored. More details to follow. The hunter guilds called Dozos. If one were to travel throughout West Africa, they would likely come across conspicuous elements of Mandinka culture, a powerful and influential people who reigned over much of the region for centuries. One of their manifestations is that of the Dozo guilds. These are brotherhoods of traditional hunters. The word Dozo itself translates to the one who returns home after a long stay in the mountains. This expression very graphically reflects the esoteric tradition behind these groups' identity. Their origin traces back to the first bands of hunters in the earliest pre-imperial Mandinka settlements who organized themselves as an armed force to defend their people. These organized groups laid the foundations for armies of the first Mandinka kings and later the Great Mali Empire itself, which was founded by Sunjata Keita in or around the year 1235. These armed confraternities are more or less secret societies where the pre-Islamic spiritual beliefs of the Mandinka are intrinsic practice. Throughout the centuries, this tight relationship with said religious beliefs made the Dozos represent the authentic bastions of Mandinka identity and keepers of tradition. This position in society, coupled with the fact that they were well-trained, organized, and armed forces, allowed them to gain huge power and influence. During the early stages of the formation of the Mali Empire, the Dozo wrestled for influence against the imperial institutions of the Gabara, or Great Council, created by Sunjata Keita, and as recently as the Civil War that ended in 2007 in the Ivory Coast, the Dozos joined the police force to help them guarantee public order and safety. The Equestrian Traditions of West Africa. There is one generalized image about Africans that has successfully been propagated throughout world history and modern history, that of the uncivilized, near-naked, or fully naked savages running around the untamed African bush with spears in hand and wearing nothing but loincloths. I was astonished the first time I came across strong evidence of the practice of horse riding in Africa. Not only had equestrian tradition existed in Africa prior to the arrival of the Europeans, but it had been the norm in most regions where geography allowed it. The first allusion in Western records to the use of cavalry in Africa relates to the Numidian allies of Carthage fighting in Sicily in the year 262 BCE. And although popular belief is that horses were introduced into Africa across the Sahara from the north, there are some theories which propose that horses had roamed freely during the Green Sahara era, and after the desertification process, some breeds remained in the Sahel and the savanna regions of this part of the continent. The evidence to support this is the existence of two distinct traditions of horsemanship, which were centered around both different breeds of horses and the technology used to ride them. A pre-Islamic tradition characterized by the use of small breeds of horses ridden without saddles and with bitless bridles is suggestive to this ancient Green Sahara heritage. The latter tradition derived from the Islamic world, associated with larger horses and the use of the bit, saddle, and stirrups, is what would become the predominant form of equestrian practice as the influence of the Islamic world spread deeper into Africa throughout the later centuries. Slavery in Africa. In their efforts to rewrite history, Eurocentric voices will gaslight by claiming that slavery was nothing new to Africa and that Africans were selling their own fellow Africans to Europeans. This take is not only ahistorical and disingenuous, but very flawed from many other fronts. It is built upon a few false premises. The first is that the institution of chattel slavery adopted during the transatlantic slave trade and the many varied forms of slavery that existed in the continent prior to European contact were essentially the same, purely based on the fact that we refer to them both as slavery, a blanket term that seldom involves any nuance. Slavery was a lamentable and regrettable part of human history regardless, yet the form practiced in the Americas was unequivocally brutal, inhumane, and destructive, a unique system of racial subjugation which has no match throughout known history, and was definitively not in existence anywhere in Africa. The second false premise revolves around the idea of Africans selling their fellow Africans, which paints all Africans as soulless, imprudent, and avid people who would be willing to sacrifice their own for a petty gain. Africans as a concept did not exist, nor did Nigerians, Kenyans, Ghanaians, or Senegalese. All of these identities that mean so much to us here in the 21st century are but byproducts of slavery and colonization. Back then, the Mosi, Mandinka, Dahomey, Ashanti, Kru, and countless others existed. These are but a few examples, but the list is endless, each with their own distinct nations, kingdoms, traditions, and histories unique to their people, in a manner no different than the French, German, or British, some friendly, some hostile, some neutral, and some completely unknown to one another. In fact, early European explorers were so aware of these differences that they'd insert themselves into the politics of the region as a means of acquiring land, power, influence, and slaves. In other words, some of these people would fight with each other, and war captives were but a mere byproduct of said wars, human phenomena which has existed for as long as we have as a species. To describe this process simply as Africans sold each other or their own people is as nonsensical and misleading as describing the Crusades as Eurasians slaughtering their own people or Hitler conquering his own people during World War II. Architectural development. Among the most popular of all fallacies leveraged against Africans is the famous "you built nothing but mud huts" trope. Not surprisingly, this trope is as ridiculous as it is completely baseless. It does nothing more than demonstrate the sheer ignorance of those uttering it. This is because they imply that both the material and design being used denote a lack of complexity or sophistication, or in more extreme cases, there will be implications that there is actually a lack of intelligence or cognitive abilities on a racial or genetic level. However, African construction technologies and architectural traditions often do quite the opposite. They epitomize human resourcefulness and ingenuity. Many of these African traditions are the result of combining various sets of key variables in the most optimal ways possible. One is availability and cost of resources. Common sense should tell you that the preferred building material used in a region would be heavily influenced by the resources available and their cost. For instance, in a heavily forested area where wood is abundant and does not require high transportation costs, you'd expect dwellings to be predominantly constructed with said material. In the case of West Africa, you can find a wide variety of materials used in construction. However, the earth and organic materials used for adobe bricks are among the most common, as the materials used are abundant and very cheap to source and transport. Moreover, climate is another important consideration. Africans are often scrutinized for not building grandiose palaces of stone and marble in the middle of the tropical rainforest or savanna, ignoring the obvious extreme weather conditions that would make such structures quite inhospitable. On the contrary, adobe is a superior material in comparison to stone in this respect, due to its thermal properties which are conducive to regulating temperatures of the building's interior. Some critics will argue contradictory statements stating that the material itself has little to do with it, or others claiming that the material has everything to do with it. This is because adobe has been used throughout many different regions of the world and within civilizations where similar climatic conditions prevailed, or how stone was used in these regions as well. This will lead some to argue that instead, the relative simplicity and lack of elegance of African architectural designs is what makes them inferior. There are many arguments that can be used to refute this, as some sub-Saharan African architectural traditions can be quite complex, while some Eurasian structures can be quite simple. However, the relative simplicity of African architecture as a whole does have some truth to it, but this goes back to climate. Africa as a continent is the only part of the world that rests almost entirely within the tropical zone, as it centers on the equator almost perfectly. With that being said, in most of Africa, weather oscillates between two seasons, a dry season and a wet season. Mud is already susceptible to water erosion, and African rainy seasons can be exceptionally wet, much more wet in fact than any place in Europe for comparison's sake. Thus, these buildings tend to require yearly maintenance and reinforcement. With that being said, African engineers and architects logically favored more minimalistic designs that could be easily restored or repaired, as the maintenance on these structures was a frequent phenomenon. Despite these very real practical challenges, some African architectural traditions still persevered to a point of notable complexity nonetheless. Additionally, stone was still used in some places, regardless of its relatively inferior thermal properties. Notable examples of this would be the ancient ruins of the Ghana Empire, or the oldest known empire in West African history, as well as the monolithic churches of Ethiopia, a collection of massive churches carved directly out of the bedrock with immaculate precision, and perhaps the most famous of all, the Great Zimbabwe Wall in southern Africa, including hundreds of similar stone structures found throughout South Africa, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Mozambique. The Griots. If West African history had a signature or symbol, I do not see any more befitting than that of the Grio. This institution has equivalents almost everywhere in the continent, where oral transmission of information prevailed over written forms. These historians, poets, public speakers, and singers were the embodiment of knowledge akin to walking, living, breathing, and talking encyclopedias. This tradition was kept within certain families and lineages, thus griots were typically endogamous. Families of griots would be connected to another family of noble birth, which would serve as praise singers, record keepers, and even advisors. The core finds itself at the center of this tradition, a long-necked harp lute which is played by male griots. Blues and other genres that use similar instruments have their roots in this West African tradition of singing, which survived through the slave trade. Irrefutable evidence of this is found in many elements, such as the vocal style of many blues singers using melisma or wavy intonation. I know that ads can get pretty annoying and repetitive, but please hear me out. It's been quite a few years since I've been using Happy Hippo products, and I can confidently say that their traditional medicine has changed my life. They help me remain focused and energized, help with my anxiety, and put me in a generally good mood. I've recommended them to my friends and family with nothing but positive results, and that is why I recommend them to you and anyone else who can benefit from them. In fact, they even have a few types of African traditional medicine as well, like akuama and kana. You can get a 10% discount on your entire order site-wide if you use my promo code FN10 at checkout at happyhippo.com. The Mosi. Amongst the immense variety of African nations in history, there is one in particular that stands out for a few different reasons. I attribute this to how peculiar they are by virtue of what historical records attribute them to. Arab historian Al-Umari quotes Mansa Musa himself describing these groups of people as a violent enemy who is to his country as the Mongols are to the Arabs. Whom Musa was referring to here were the Mosi. They were a cluster of kingdoms who, like the classical Greek city-states, waged war against each other as often as they warded off the greatest empires of their respective time periods. Their strength was built upon their cavalry, which allowed them to conquer vast territories in the plains of the Sahel, raiding and looting deep into their enemies' homelands. The Mosi kingdoms were by all measures significantly more belligerent than most other states and nations, and many historians still wonder why. Essentially, an African Mongol horde who terrorized their neighbors in medieval West Africa, building kingdoms which have survived all the way up to our time. The title of Mogul Naba, meaning Lord of the Land in the Mosi country, is still held in the present day by the most notable and powerful of all the Mosi kings. The Trans-Saharan Trade. Africa's current regression and underdevelopment has falsely been attributed to a natural and historical lack of advancement, as opposed to the result of systemic depletion and undermining by Western imperialist powers. Often dubbed the Dark Continent purely due to the racism, ignorance, and malicious intention of those who came to exploit it, But how could such a dark and inept backwater create so many great civilizations? Complex territorial and social organizations which created and maintained systems of commerce which connected them to the wider world. The trade network that interlinked West Africa with the rest of the world is not a mere footnote of history. The British Library holds a 19th century manuscript written by a local scholar from Kumasi, the capital city of the former Ashanti Empire in what is now present-day Ghana, which contains instructions for reading the works of alchemy by Persian philosopher Al-Ghazali. Commodities, knowledge, and people effectively traveled throughout these geographical arteries, which connected the coastal rainforests of Central and Western Africa with the Mediterranean world via trade routes crossing the Sahara Desert. Salt, copper, cloth, and brass were exchanged for cola, slaves, spices, gold, and wood. The trade routes facilitated the spread of Islam, scholarly, and ideas. With it, the demand for books and written works rapidly occupied a huge share in this trade, fostering book copying industries in cosmopolitan cities like Timbuktu. The diversity of raw materials, specialized skills of various groups, and large-scale organization was what stimulated trade and became the economic base of the Mali Empire. Imperial control of the trade routes generated immense tax revenues rather than direct participation in the trade itself. The author of this video is also the author of a historical book written about the Mosi kingdoms of pre-colonial West Africa. Again, this is not sponsored, it's just a recommendation. If you enjoyed this brief overview of West African history, be sure to check out his book, Grio's Tell No Lies, available on Amazon now. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on notifications. For sources, check out my website, fromnothing.info. For links to products, Patreon, Discord, or anything else to support or become a part of the Empire from Nothing, click on my link tree down below. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.